I'd just like to say thank you to the whole team here. It was a great pleasure. I mean, it was technically difficult, as you can imagine, to bring together a show with so many artists and all of those different technical requirements. But intellectually, it was just a really great adventure. So thanks to everyone here. I should say a little bit about the genesis of the show. At least for my part, I can't speak for my co-curator, but I had a background in filmmaking and photography, and in fact, my first real, first photographs I really liked were in books about cinema, and I noticed that those kinds of photographs never appeared in the history of photography, film stills or frames from movies. They were always a kind of orphan hybrid form. And when I first got a fairly serious camera, an SLR camera, the first pictures I took were pointed at a TV screen, trying to get nice moments from movies by Hitchcock and Fellini. I'm showing my age here because this was even before home VHS. So I used to shoot transparencies of TV screens, just trying to get the images I liked. And that fascination has always stayed with me. And it might be that the frame from a movie is in a way is a sort of a model or a sort of an origin story for what's going on in the show. And Joachim mentioned my interest in Walker Evans, and I came across a video recording of a very late lecture that Evans gave to some students in around 1974. He died in 1975. And one of the students asked a really interesting question. The student said, "I know you're really interested in movies," and this was because during the war, Second World War, Walker Evans wrote film reviews for Time magazine. And the student said, are you still interested in movies after all these years? And he said, yeah, I go to the movies all the time. And the student said, what are the movies that you've seen lately that are really great? And he said, well, I've seen two movies by Robert Altman, The Long Goodbye and McCabe and Mrs. Miller. He said, I don't know if they're shot by the same person. They were, actually. They were both shot by a cinematographer called Vilmos Zsigmond. And then Walker Evans grew very quiet, and he said, those films are a marvelous bunch of photography. A marvelous bunch of photography. A really interesting way to describe a movie. I mean, of course, technically, that's what movies are. They're photographs looked at in an unusual way. Under very particular circumstances. But it's an interesting way that a photographer might think of movies. So that might be another kind of origin story, at least from my interest in the show. You'll know that it brings together historical things, contemporary things, works made in lots of different media, works presented in lots of different formats. We didn't set out with a kind of encyclopedic idea of covering a spectrum. We simply tried to bring works together that might have an interesting dialogue with each other, but also works that could well be in other kinds of exhibitions where the emphasis is slightly different. Which brings me to David's work. I mean, whenever a curator puts together a thematic show, I feel I always have to be very careful about respecting, not just respecting the presentation of the artist's work, but respecting the creative and intellectual integrity of the work. I don't like shows where a work is just used to make some curatorial point. So I'm opening myself up for criticism here, because I don't know what David actually thinks, but what do you think about your works in the context of this show?
I mean, some artists produce works in order to get a curator's attention and get them into a particular show.
You don't do that, surely?
No, but I have hopes always when I start that a piece will have a career in exhibitions, although I'm always very cautious with. In fact, I make myself no illusions when I give a piece for a show. That this is going to be, that it will be in its right place, and that it will be. Usually, artists like to be autonomous when they. So art and artists make objects that do not always live together very well. No. But exceptionally, for Belgium, I think you did a great job in placing the works here. This is always over the years. Installing gave me, I think, unjustified reputation of being a difficult artist to work with. Well, I think I learned that actually from Jaffol, who once said, "I don't trust anybody. I don't even trust my mother to do the right thing for me." And I think that would apply to myself also. Because often when I trusted the curator, and usually I kept my mouth shut for sort of the more important exhibitions like Biennales, or where you think keep a low figure, and then it turns out that you're completely misunderstood. But after all, a projection is flexible and fluid thing. One should not deny its origins as light, touching a canvas or a wall. So one should also not be too dogmatic in installation instructions, and in fact, over the years, there's been a few experiences, such as very old work in media terms. This is old from, let's say, a piece from 2002, which in nowadays perception is so pixelated and so sort of appearing in low res.
Yes.
It gets a certain criticism from a curator. It was in Berlin in an exhibition, and he asked the question: do we really have to project it that big? Because it actually can't really handle the size, and it was in fact always projected like that, and nothing ever changed. It's just that we change, we evolve, and so why not get it smaller? It would not be an issue. But anyway, there is a difference. And maybe this is why I started working with ephemeral, with an ephemeral medium like light projected onto a wall or a canvas. It's a phenomenon that doesn't coexist very well with others because of its definition as light. Light doesn't coexist very well with light, and I think there's probably a reason why I chose to work on photography, if I do, through something that is not necessarily known as that doesn't have the paper, or that doesn't have the. And you were speaking about your youth and your reproductions of stills with a camera, and I realized I have a similar story, or a similar start. I didn't know anything about photography, in fact, but I was very good at drawing, and I had been living with art, one could say, since a very early age, but photography was really something to which I had very little access. And we are speaking about like age 25, maybe between 25 and 30. But I did have a Minolta camera, which was very expensive for me, but which was in fact quite a modest camera. And I spent many years reproducing stills from television, like you did, but also from libraries. I had a technique to enter into a library and to photograph or to make reproductions unseen, or even in commercial libraries. And I often got caught by reproducing in commercial libraries and thrown out. And I still have boxes full of slides of that time, and that must have been the beginning of the 90s.
Yes.
And I was always, at that time, I had already a past of like 10, 15 years of painting and drawing, and I was so fed up with the object of art that I really would have preferred to digitize everything and forget about it. But I was very hungry. It was really like my week was fine if I had made like 150 or 200 reproductions in books. But I had somehow no interest of going out in the street and taking pictures outside. And that only came much later, much more recent, when I admitted to myself as a hobbyist photographer.
But in a way it's come full circle, because your current practice is very studio based. You don't seem to be getting out much anymore.
Yes, I still get out much, but but I don't produce, let's say, outside.
Yes.
And I've learned a lot through the years. Basically, the way my studio grew was I tried to invest every little bit of money that I had in new equipment. So I was very equipment hungry, sort of materialistic kind of guy who collected film equipment, film light, cameras, Steadicams, you name it. And I have, at this point, I have so many cameras I wouldn't even have an overview of how many I have. But the point is that everything I touched upon, I wanted to get to know it.
Yeah. But that has a very interesting relation to the desire to dematerialize the art object.
It's
it's
paradoxical in nature.
In order to produce something of pure light, of a certain standard, of a certain technique, it requires a lot of equipment. So it's not, you don't really get rid of the object, you just displace it.
It's true, and in fact it even became a topic, something that I pursued consciously, that labor and money could be spent in great amounts, especially labor, as long as it didn't leave a physical trace. And as long as the work itself would be some kind of negative of that.
Yeah.
Where maybe if it settled down in your memory or in your awareness of what had happened in a piece or in a slideshow, like in Algiers sections of A Happy Moon, for example, all you could grasp would be that this surely is not a production by a camera. Or by a camera in front of an object, but this is a production done by planning and with a lot of effort.
Yeah.
So human effort and labor increasingly became important as obviously not as a spectacle, but as if there's behind the work. There would be a certain volume of labor.
I mean, just thinking about it, and I've not really thought about this before, but I'm sure that was part of my interest in film stills, that somehow, $100 million movie ends up as a picture on a page. But that money would never have been spent. That production would never have been embarked upon if that was the end goal. So you know that you're looking something in a way which humiliates the whole question of labour, and in a way that's historic. Just if you sort of look across the 20th century, that was always part of the radical appeal of photography, that there was no correspondence between labour and artistic merit. You could have 15 people working to produce a photograph, or a kid could go out in the street and just do something extraordinary with a single frame. And there's something very, very liberating but unsettling about that. Same with filmmaking. I love it when, I shouldn't because it's quite sadistic, but I really like it when an enormous amount of money is spent on a film and it completely flops. Because you know that cultural value can't be predicted. It's a reminder that, okay, it's an industry, but it's not really, the kind of Adorno culture industry. Okay, yeah, fair enough. There's a kind of institutional model, but really can't be predicted, and outcomes can't really be guaranteed, and that's really liberating, I think. Because I know you've done films that are videos that are incredibly complex, but you've also done very, very simple things.
Yes, it's true that that over the years there seemed to be a crescendo in the amount of effort that went into something, as if every piece would potentially be your last one.
Yeah.
And I think at this point, or at least for myself, I've reached a point where I have to, where I'm taking it in a slightly different direction.
Yeah.
Maybe in a moment I can show you a few stills of work that have been actually the culmination of this this effort. But it is. It's very simple. It's a way of not being forgotten, is by putting stone upon stone upon stone upon stone until you can no more. And perhaps even without a plan. And cinema, in terms of production budgets, is in trouble, as we know, because the very expensive productions have to be ever more controlled and guaranteed up ahead, as if it would be possible to know what the box office result is going to be. The producers are taking less and less risks, and of course underneath that there's an entire sort of sub-industry opening up with cheap productions that actually move up and take over in a way. So it's, in fact, perhaps it's possible to say that I was always quite envious as a young artist of people like, for example, Jeff Fall, who would take the luxury in time and in effort to spend a long time cogitating about a piece and chewing for a long time on it until it then sort of crystallizes. And I loved the idea that something would auto produce itself. sometimes looked at as good wine, like, oh, this took 16 years to produce, or this took 9 years to produce, and up until the point where, actually being a very impatient person, my average would be 5 years, maybe sometimes a bit less. And naturally, if the piece is no good, then it's terrible, because you've spent a big chunk of your life. It does happen, I hope rarely, but it does happen. And I solve my the slowness of work, which maybe we should later on maybe talk a little bit more about the length of a production, even if it ends up in a still or in a series of stills. Some photographers that I've looked at actually consciously put this in their work. Yeah. The idea that they would have spent so much time in front of the situation that the thing would have crystallized itself, would have performed itself, and I always sort of was interested in that.
But it's I mean, that's an interesting question with Jeff Wall, not least because we're showing probably the least representative piece that Jeff has ever made, which is not shown very often. He generally makes single images which are meant to be seen alone, judged alone, pictorially. And we have this very sort of elliptical sort of narrative sequence that can be read in either way. Just to say, also those two light boxes can be mounted in either position. So not only can the narrative be read one way or the other, the two parts can be placed the other way around. But it's interesting that he's a figure that became sort of identified with very complex production techniques. And to some extent he feels a bit uncomfortable about that, because he's also made very, very simple pictures, very, very straightforward pictures, just
I was going to say
going
that
out with a camera and photographing something just like a documentary photographer would. Understanding that that's the way the medium works, but also artistically there's nothing to say. The labor is what you do just in order to produce what it is you feel you have to produce. We do live in a culture that does make a fetish of the spectacle of labor. Maybe that comes from cinema and that comes from advertising. People paying money, so they want to see the money somehow manifested. I mean, often the works that Jeff has lavished the most time and production on are some of the most understated pictures. They don't look particularly spectacular at all.
There's well, obviously when he started in the early 1980s or mid 70s, I imagine.
Yeah, late 70s.
The picture that appeared as if it was a waiting object, as if it had all the time in the world, and that had taken a long time to produce, was something that nowadays is it's almost more natural to think of a composited image, and the poor image, on the other hand, has taken the lead in this sort of authenticity culture, and that I can imagine that has made him feel at one point, or at least it was a bit confusing at one point, I suppose, because it generated so many artists who when big format, and but these are thrills, cheap thrills maybe, that which every generation goes through, and it's in the nature of these technologies that they are being replaced with another.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's something. It's not something I would have to admit that Joachim and I thought about extensively while we were doing it, but we knew in the back of our minds that we were not only showing works made at different periods, but as always with, you know, just camera-based images generally, the technology is moving so fast, and technological questions are always bound up with aesthetic questions and technical questions with camera images. And it's interesting to think about what work ages well, what appears to not age well, and then suddenly it does appear to be aging well. And you know, often works which are made not necessarily at the cutting edge, but close to the cutting edge, go through a period of looking slightly gauche and awkward, but then they emerge somewhere else, and you can see their artistic qualities a little clearer, and it's fascinating.
They often don't escape a certain optimism, sort of, how do you call it, belief in techno-humanism, where technology will push humanism a little bit further, and then obviously this technology becomes redundant, and you see that actually humanism was pushed further in a different direction, and makes it look redundant. So this optimism is, or it can be a problem, and I've found often that this was like, I remember seeing an exhibition of Nam June Paik in Düsseldorf, where I was spending most of the time fascinated with the technology, in a negative way, in the sense that I was looking at the archival qualities of the technology, and I was basically only seeing that, and it was very hard to, in my head, and I think even more difficult in the heads of other spectators, to translate that. This is why probably I think it's very postmodern to think of production from out of what Luc Tuymans once upon a time called, I think it was called authentic forgery, when he was commented upon painting his paintings looking very old while they were freshly painted. There's a certain awareness in artists to, and maybe that's got something to do why I worked in the beginning with found black and white footage, is because I realized the pieces would never actually have a future, or the future would never decline in along the technology that was used, because it already had gone through this process of orphanizing,
so
can you call it like that?
Anticipating the problem.
Anticipating it.
I hadn't thought about it that way, but that's interesting.
And I, through the years, I've started to look at our relation to technology as one where obviously we keep on correcting, and it's time-based media, so it probably also means that time will not keep it, and time will replace it with another medium.
But there's replacement, but then there's accumulation. You know, if you tell the story of sort of image technologies, it's tempting to say they did it like this, and then they did it like this, and then they did it like this. But in fact, it seems that we're kind of gathering everything up all the time. There's no reason why you can't make a daguerreotype. And it will give you a result that nothing else will give you. And to that extent, it must still be contemporary. It's a bit like Marshall McLuhan, you know, the Canadian media theorist. You know, he said new image. Well, he was actually talking about communications technologies. He said new communications technologies don't replace the older ones, but they do redefine them on new terms. And then interestingly, he was asked what will replace television. This was in 1964. And his answer was interesting. He said, I don't know what will replace television, but I know it will include television, which is what the internet is. Somehow it would sort of pull itself along. And of course, when you do a show that has a certain kind of historical sweep like this, there are works in the show that are made as absolutely state of the art with the very latest technology. I suppose the Lumiere film would be the obvious one. But then you have an artist, who's using, let's say, a 16mm projector because it's an eclipsed form, because it's an obsolete practice, but it's all in the same show, and
It's true, and I used to occasionally arrive at studios of young artists in academies all over Europe, and at one point I started noticing the preference for 16 and 8mm cameras and working with technical still cameras. I'd never actually known why, but neither could the students explain what attracted themselves. I suppose, well, I don't know, but I suppose it's got something to do because it's related to skin. The film has, with its transforming capacity, is related to skin, and therefore not maybe identified as something that's not integrated, and therefore cannot be swallowed up by the internet or something like that, or at least the internet, and therefore more real.
It's invested with a kind of resistance to kind of consensual categories of but at the same time, I mean, it's interesting, I've just started my teaching year, and my new first years are kind of absolutely salivating when they see the black and white darkrooms. They just think this is it. And inside I'm thinking, if Alexander Rodchenko or Laszlo Moholy-Nagy had seen one of these, they'd have just gone mad. They'd have just been so excited. That's what it was, which is partly why we have there's one camera in the show, which comes from the really beautiful collection of cameras here, and it's called the SEPT, French camera, SEPT, which was launched in the early 20s, and this was a camera that could shoot stills, it could shoot moving footage, it had a motor drive, it converted into a projector. It converted into an enlarger head. It could print frame sequences. It could print single images. And it's amazing to think that there was a desire for, cameras don't just appear spontaneously. There was a desire for a camera that could do that. In many ways, it can do more than that iPhone. In the early 20s, I mean, it's staggering. We like to think that the problems, our problems, are only our problems now, and that no one's, or our challenges or our excitements are ours only. But the more you look at the history of photography and film, the more you realize that so many of our concerns have come up before. It's not to say that there aren't new problems and new challenges. That's definitely true. But more have come up before than one first realizes. And you do have to. I feel I'm constantly adjusting to that. That there's. I mean, it's an amazing thought that there was in fact, Rodchenko bought one of those cameras. In fact, he bought two, and he gave one to Ziga Vertov, and they both got very excited about it.
But it still goes on naturally. This I also moved from one sphere of interest in photography or in picture making to another by the sheer excitement of technology. But I mean, naturally, this is as I said, this is an awareness that I think one has, that if you actually bite in the apple,
Yes.
you'll pay the price. And but I still, still have to bite in the apple
Yes.
to just to know. And I find myself constantly on this surf of, and that's what's so interesting about looking at past excitements in technologies, and let's stay with photography. When you try to, I've very often, I've kind of grew up with imagery of the Second World War somehow, because of my two grandfathers who were both telling me a lot about it. My dad too. I came from a region which was, in both world wars, had been heavily touched. And so, and I still do. I probably haven't. Well, no, that can't be true. But I would almost say I haven't seen any moving image that dates from around the Second World War, which has ever been made. It's certainly not true, but I've seen quite a lot. And systematically, I find myself trying to connect wires back to actuality, back to the actual looking, as if there were some kind of original looking at a picture for the first time, and where these grainy old images wouldn't have given up on their actuality and wouldn't have retrieved in sort of a technological dust bin. And this is, of course, this is something that maybe, I'm not sure, because it's very, it's risky to predict technologies in the future, but it's maybe wiser to stick to how vision is changing rather than technologies.
Sure, yes.
And maybe vision is moving towards, we were briefly talking about it, towards an integrated system where which we would look at risky, creepy, maybe a horror scenario where what you see and what you think and what you're being shown are in a certain sync, which undermine, in my experience, what photography was at one point. It was essentially an ideology of light and a piece of glass and sensitivity. You can actually backtrace the old technologies into ideologies, where the glass would be a window onto something, and the light would be hope for light versus darkness. But the story of darkness in photography and of course in cinema is not very often told, but it's as present naturally than as the light. And the hard part is to look at, and I know Rodchenko must have said that too, or I imagine he must have said that too, that the hard part is to observe your current situation and to see what's going on.
Yes.
And it looks like we're heading towards a system of radical integration, but in fact, when I think back at the invention of photography, basically radical integration is just part of modernity. These excitements and the event of shock and replacement and
Yes.
and redundancy and the new is part of modernity, and it's part of learning how to how does Harari say it? Learning how to give up meaning for power.
Yeah. And within that, what would it mean to let's try to think vision, as being something that's connected with the history of ideology and the history of what happens to the imagination under the pressures of capital, and what that actually does to something like noticing, and the again, I remember Jeff Wall once saying, I want to make my pictures like eyesight. I want the photographs to look and feel like eyesight. But of course, what eyesight is a very complex thing, because you can stare at something, you can notice something out of the corner of your eye. Something can be moving while you're still. Something can be moving while you're moving, watching it. Looking at something that you find beautiful is not the same thing as looking at something that repels you. So the whole question of what eyesight is a very complicated question, and photography historically has been very split. There's been on the one hand there's a kind of move towards, it's there in filmmaking too, a kind of move towards trying to close the gap between vision and image making. And in a way, something like, there's one Cartier-Bresson picture in the show, but that whole drive towards the decisive moment, to close the gap between what it is to notice and what it is to make an image. There's that, but against that is the idea of the image being a kind of perfect photograph which represents the world the way photography can, which might not be anything like eyesight. And Jeff Wall is a great admirer of Eugene Adjé, the French photographer who's working from the 1880s into the 20s. And he said when you look at his photographs, they don't look anything like eyesight. They just look like really exquisite photographic representations. And that those are beautiful things to contemplate, but they don't. They're not inviting you to think about what eyesight is. Or maybe they are, but in a different way, by being so different to eyesight. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I often think this when I'm looking at your work, between sort of falling into the image as a kind of sort of dreamy naturalism, and then being sort of thrown out of the image and sort of looking at it. What is this slightly alien thing that's seductive, but is not really how my vision operates?
But throughout history, there is, and more specifically, since the start of modernity, there's an emphasis on, and it depends when you want to start modernity. Some say Goya was first modern artist. Others, I would tend it's even Piero della Francesca. That the stare. There's a relation to. There's a certain distrust for eyesight to be reduced to a stare, and vision is constantly back and forth being used as a medium of power, passing through Renaissance and today, when I work in virtual reality, I constantly reminded of very simple perspectivist principles that date back to the 15th century, essentially, which have not changed, but which have found a sophistication. And oh yeah, this is something that I thought was always interesting in photography, is that as a medium, it employs something that capitalism necessarily needs, and that's to keep something hidden while expose in glory something very obvious. So to give you the idea of transparency and vision, while actually necessarily hiding a part of the process from you.
Fetishism.
And fetishism, yeah. And you get this throughout the centuries. You get this crystallization that this thing by artists has more to do with a certain resistance.
Yeah.
Resistance against radical integration of vision into thought, and I believe we are at with the image being softer than ever, and being harder or being more hidden than ever. In its way, we're saying goodbye to a particular state of the photograph, which was one person with one object and in one place. And there is a possibility that, and that might be actually an anxiety of people like Jeff Wall, is that the tableau comes back in a all-powerful disguise through the figure of the algorithm, a picture of which you could never actually trace the code. Yeah. So that sometimes makes me think that photography already is, and when I see these online platforms for photographers, usually street photographers, they like to come online because it's a real place for street photographers. I already get a sense that they are celebrating a ritual,
yeah,
as if they're parading in vintage costumes, and that street photography is it's already in this matrix.
So it's it's a sort of old-fashioned signifier of the real that's then presented in the virtual space of the online platform.
Well, actually, if you would if you go online, it doesn't. There's no difference, but still, I sense.
Yes.
I sense that there's no connection to. And I had a confrontation with French photographer Noël Kidou once upon a time, who confronted me when I asked him to use a picture of him, who confronted me with what it is. Have you ever been in a war zone, and have you ever been killed almost, or have you ever been, did you risk your life taking a picture? We could have had an interesting conversation, but unfortunately we were both, I think, very professional in what we did, but I was aware of the different worlds. And I could have been nasty with him, or he could have been with me, but we kind of decided to keep.
But would you prefer that photojournalism of the front line didn't exist, or?
Oh no! I'm very happy it exists. I'm just saying that it's as a practice, and this goes very slowly.
Yeah.
As a practice, it gradually turns into a certain aesthetic, and from the aesthetic, it turns into an academy, and from the academy, it actually doesn't matter whether you're on the battlefield or not, or whether you're in the street or not.
Yeah, no, it's historical costume at that point,
Yeah.
I guess, in the way you were phrasing it. But it's interesting that there's no. I mean, if cameras can enter into any social situation, which they do, there's nothing to say that any of that is illegitimate, and the claim for photography to have a legitimate part of, let's say, reporting, witnessing, is interesting because it's never underpinned by the camera itself. It always requires testimony on behalf of the image. It always requires someone to say, yes, this is the circumstance under which the picture was taken, this is what's going on. But in a way, something like reportage had always grown up as an image text practice. It was never just a pictorial matter, in a way. But it's interesting. There was an artist who was a candidate, definitely. He doesn't have any work in the show, but it had certainly informed my thinking, which is Victor Bergin, British artist, who spent a lot of time recently making computer-generated image work. And he was in the piece we nearly showed. It's called A Place to Read. And it was made in 2006, I believe, and it was commissioned by I think it was commissioned by an architectural biennale in Istanbul. So Victor went to Istanbul, and he got very interested in a kind of socialist, modernist coffee house that was built on a hilltop overlooking the Bosphorus, and it was set up on very kind of utopian lines in that kind of brief moment of Istanbul's history, end of the Ottoman era and before it becomes the new kind of globalized gateway for capitalism. And Victor got very interested in this coffee house and went to see it and found that it wasn't where it was built, but the whole area had been bought by the Swiss hotel chain, and they had moved it away from partially rebuilt it as a kind of orientalist, tourist, fantasy restaurant. And Victor wanted to reconstruct in a kind of virtual environment what this coffee house had been, which he did. So he got hold of the plans, he got hold of photographs, and the video piece he made was a number of camera movements in and around this coffee house in its kind of ideal utopian state, intercut with a number of texts about a woman who's in London and dreaming of being in Istanbul. And anyway, but the interesting thing was, when it was shown in Istanbul for the first time on the opening night, there were people in tears. And it took Victor by surprise, you know. And in this age, we think of, you know, tears as being associated with some kind of real image, or, you know, the index or the trace, and here's a completely virtual environment which is evoking crying in a number of people. It's nothing to do with the image being a kind of manifestation of something physical in the world, or if it is, it's only in a very, very indirect way. But of course, most of the time, computer-generated images are meant to entertain you. They're not meant to make you cry, and that probably says more about cultural, the position of the virtual environment at the moment. That it's not supposed to be something that taps into those kinds of feelings about loss or political catastrophe, or we can do. There's no reason why. No reason. Sorry, it's a long story, but it's an interesting. Tells us something very interesting about the place of the virtual now.
It's a field of, on one hand, in virtual reality and artificially produced shapes and light. It's a field of extreme specialization, but it's also revealingly very confronting in terms of what you think are the objects of the world. Because a picture that's, already images taken with phones have so much information in them that comes through data and not through the actual singularity of being there and taking this picture. Even the moment in which you take the picture possibly changes the lighting, because the camera knows it's 6 o'clock in the evening, sun is setting, blah, blah, blah. But it's just the beginning. When we, in the studio, speak about a particular image or a sequence, if there's no, there are of course always the reference are come through cameras, or come through pictures. They often come through found pictures, very often, ideally in fact. But you find
found, you mean
from the
analog?
From the internet, analog. Actually, something somebody made for you, and you didn't have to make it.
Yes.
But you find yourself discussing about things that are you would never have thought you would have to discuss if you would have had a camera. Things that kind of slipped into the image naturally, so to speak, and which you have to, like the color of grass. Which season is it? What's the humidity? Which continent? Which lens are you using? And up to the point where we've been trying to discuss with somebody who builds trees for film companies. Very sophisticated. There are trees that grow by themselves. And I wanted to do something with the tree that grows backwards over time. But this a young woman, I think she's 25, but she's had to study biology quite intensively in order to understand the growth of what trees actually do. And this is a career of one person in a young woman's research project. And so you find yourself immediately in a kind of rhizome of a network which goes infinitely far, and somehow does away with image making that would be automatic in a way. And the automatic comes in elsewhere, I can assure you. It's not that the automatic isn't there. It's always with us, because that's what we want to do when we are modern. We want to be as automatic as possible and to disappear behind it. So it's not that so the automatization comes back in a disguised form somewhere else, and tells you that well, we're in Europe, it's that season, it's this humidity, it's this, that, and before I know, I've made a statement about myself and what I'm thinking about a certain image. And I've had to defend things that I thought I would never have to defend about the picture. And that's so the.
But in a way, one can't make an image without those.
No, but they get laid out on the table
Yes.
before.
Rather than simply being incorporated automatically by having a camera in the world.
And therefore, of course, as an artist, I would be always very suspicious of the other thing. When it's laid out on the table, what is it I'm missing that's coming in my through my back?
Yes. But that was always the fascination with the photographic image, you know, right back to the sort of late 1830s when photography is invented. You have a number of writers, you know, pointing out that what's new about the optical image is that you will always get more than you wanted. You know, if I want to take a photograph of this bottle from here, I'll get everything else around it. I don't even have to think about those things. It will arrive in the picture. And that becomes the guarantee of a new model of realism. That realism is about the excess of information, automated information that you've not desired, but you get, and it guarantees the authenticity of the thing that you do desire in the picture. You know, this is why, you know, if the more you clean up a picture with Photoshop, the less real it begins to appear, because you've got rid of precisely that, you know, what Walter Benjamin had called the optical unconscious. You know, all of that stuff that comes into the picture without you having to think too much about it. But it's interesting that's a kind of automation that's sort of in front of the lens in a way. But once you get to the virtual camera in the kind of way you're doing, you're talking about the automation coming the other way somehow, that it has to. There are other forces that produce the automation.
Yes, with a certain suspicion for a return to the tableau in a way.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that as a collectively, the photographic image, it's very hard to let go of this excess information and therefore the authenticity. So there's currently, I believe, nothing else we can do than to, while seeing it transforming, still continue to be inside that ideology.
Yeah.
And which is not a small thing, and also not a small risk in a way.
Yeah.
Because any social and political decision is can be disrupted by a picture, the wrong picture at the wrong moment. So we kind of follow the religion, but we're actually not sure anymore if. And basically, to photography is happening maybe what happened to painting at one point, before modernity, is that I will not call it ruins, because ruins are not functional. It's the opposite. It's still very functional.
Yes.
But it's already been absorbed by something else.
Yeah.
And we're still forced to live it as our main religion, or image culture. but somehow we know that it's already used for something new.
Yeah. Yeah.
So which generates a strange distrust towards the image. Probably similar to what must have happened to the canvas at one point in time.
There's a lot around that in your work, not in your work, but that is, I think, is going to come as a response to your work around a kind of balancing act between trust and distrust and.
It's strange. Very early on, in the 90s, I had a good friend whom we debated a lot about. He was a painter, I wasn't anymore, and we were, when we spoke about images, it was really almost as if we were nursing a thing, something that was at risk of being lost forever, or being seen through pornographic gaze or something, something of which you thought this thing has to be rewired. And I believe that trust can only happen through a process of distrust. I mean, materialistically speaking,
Sure,
in terms of medium and way of working, and.
But related to that, can I ask you something? This was also something I was thinking about in the putting together of the show. That okay, if we do a show that's called The Still Point, The Turning World, it might be about the still image and the moving image. Then the question is, well, what's moving and how much? And suddenly we're into questions of speed and tempo and duration and certain kind of experience. And if you were a sort of modern avant-gardist in the 20s and 30s, you'd have been interested in speed. Those were the calling cards somehow. Once you get to kind of post-war, not quite avant-garde culture, but let's say a kind of counterculture or a cinema of some kind of resistance, or it's suddenly all about slowness. The great auteurs, modernist auteurs of the 20s and 30s are thinking about speed. And then as soon as you get to the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and you can go on, criticality, the idea of criticality or an aesthetic of resistance is completely locked into slowness and not speed anymore. That you can't resist by being fast. That you have to resist by being slow. That's a real caricature about the first half of the 20th century, but there's something in that. There's something interesting about. I've looked at this. This is the first time I've seen this show since the day it opened, and I'm struck by a certain kind of tempo that's fairly consistent through the show, which I wasn't really thinking about. And I wonder how consciously artists think about that, or whether they've just internalized slowness as the position. Because there's no, I won't say anymore. But tell me about your relation to why does that camera movement take quite that much time to move around Elvis in that room? Do you play things faster and slower?
I find myself having endless discussions in my studio with my assistants on things that I try out and which systematically I find it too fast. And we slow things down up until the point usually where I just kick it out and I say, we work with the still. As if this is sort of necessary evil to get to sort of purification of, which naturally it isn't. But I'd like to make a distinction between, because slowness is often hijacked by the idea, or people claiming that it's the only way to reflect, and that slowness is part of reflection. But in fact, what interests me is to see this incredible speed sometimes, and the exercise of having, and that's what's energy, to have this, the exercise of looking at a single thing or a single image, and to see a very speedy line through it, and be able to connect two dots between a past and a present, for example, which is one of the base fascinations with old photography. Slowness itself is, culturally, is maybe the it can be two things. You know, it can be the negative of speed. So slow motion.
Yeah.
Would
I mean, slow is always a relative term.
Yes. What would slow motion be? It would
Yes.
probably be the retarded brother of fast motion.
Yes. Yes.
So that means that culturally motion is still sort of the dominant system.
Yeah.
And there, yes, quite consciously, artists may push the brake.
But without stopping.
Without stopping, and there is an interesting new triangle between forward progressing, backward regressing, and the point in time which is current,
Yes.
which an awareness that comes together with the digital age, I suppose, because everybody is gets to know it in one way or another, whether it's in photography or in another way, or even in writing and editing of text. That there seems to be a triangle where you can skip the process of progressing forward, and you can simultaneously move backwards. And that's an awareness which is, I don't know if that's a novel awareness, but it's certainly one which that has informed my work in trying to find a space where a picture would neither be condemned to progress forward forever, or it would neither be condemned to live in the past. And it would have a certain rhythm of breathing. And at one point, breathing...
So it's just something that just continues to be.
To be.
Yes.
And the analogy, of course, to biology is maybe evident. Breathing would be a rhythm to which I would often look, and in editing and in deciding a certain a rhythm.
Yeah. I mean, it's the tempo is not entirely consistent in the show. I mean, there's the John Stezaker's flashing horse piece, and also Jason D's 24 times a second, with these images of sort of racing around the screen. I'm acutely aware of time. We actually have to be out of here in about 12 minutes, but you've been extraordinarily good-natured in your attention. So I wondered if there was any thoughts or questions among you, or we can take up the rest of our time with perhaps your voices.
I'm aware we've been going a little bit on a duo trip here.
Well,
with
we decided we weren't going to plan anything, so just let it wander. Oh, is that a hand at the back? Sir, hi. Do you want to just shout?
I'll try.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, thanks, guys. You mentioned something earlier about a certain drive within contemporary photography towards more clean, kind of authentic or simulating authenticity or style. And I was curious whether you think this is more because it's a reflection of the times, let's say, or is it more driven by the art market, which in general seems to like things which are more digestible.
That seemed to be two questions. Was that for David or for
No.
David? No, for Dan. Wait, the art market. So the art market is money, capital.
Authenticity. The way in which a certain kind of authenticity is kind of conjured up by a certain kind of.
Authenticity naturally is also one of these things on the table. Which come under a light of scrutiny, but they've been. I mean, that's just part of being in this awkward world, which is the modern world, is that you scrutinize, but naturally. The image technologies, we'll always call them new image technologies, they only evolve because there's money to be made. And then somebody's gotten the vision to move these things forward, simply because there's a lot of money to be gained. Wait, I'm trying to remember what your question was.
But there's something interesting about the idea that that there could be such a thing as this image that's authentic and this image that's inauthentic, rather than thinking about intention or response, or I mean that's what's interesting about the Victor Bergin story. I mean, clearly his intentions are authentic. His intentions are honorable. His intentions are careful, and the tears that are evoked are not cheap. Not cheap tears. They're authentic because they speak to the reality of that kind of political catastrophe, and it's nothing to do. But you wouldn't point to the image and say,
but
that's
an authentic that's what we tend to do.
Yes.
So about authenticity, it's in fact the question: is it to me what it is to another?
Yeah.
So is it sameness? That's another way of seeing authenticity. Is it sameness? And we kind of have to prepare for a world in which sameness does not come from a picture, but from information in a way.
Yeah.
And
but there's it's the gods of authenticity striking us down. What was I going to say? There's I think we're currently caught in a horrible moment where the idea of authenticity or not this happens not so much in film, but it happens a lot in photography, that it's invested in either a kind of a certain kind of apparatus, or a certain kind of materiality, or it's why a 20-year-old will go into a darkroom, because they think, well, this is not the corporate consensual. Yeah, but it's as if it was in the dark room, as if authenticity was in there, and if you went in and you switched the red light on, you'd find authenticity. It's a ridiculous idea in a way,
But the past is a good accomplice with
for a kind of fake
for
authenticity.
authenticity.
Yeah.
It always is, no.
Yes.
But that, you know, that where I'm a little bit worried sometimes is that authenticity is something that can be, and that is produced. That if authenticity is indeed a mutual recognition of the same thing and nothing else than that, if that's essentially authenticity,
It's a conservative category then.
then yes, and it's also possible to reproduce that.
Yeah.
Is it possible to reproduce it?
Well, that's what they say in American politics, isn't it? You know, if you can fake authenticity, you've got it made. You know,
Yeah.
that's the one
Yeah.
thing you need to be able to
Yeah.
do. Appear to be the same.
And there is a relation between the camera and that, so
Yes.
the faking and the camera are conjured in the same gesture. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But maybe, as I think, to stick with the materiality of light and photography, as the light goes out, that's what's happening, and data comes in. The light becomes a memory, just like the darkroom is a memory of a certain act of revealing something. And it's often said that we live in a certain time of twilight. No, that is modernity is always. I keep on going back to modernity
Yes.
because I read about it a little bit. But it's this period where you start living with twilight as the current as the situation in which your life will
Yeah.
never come out of.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's easy to think of this transition towards darkness as a transition in which, we need to remember as much as possible of what we've seen.
Yeah.
And so what was it that we've seen? It's actually not what we've seen through a lens, but it's things that we've actually thought we experienced. Very often we didn't experience them. But they come back to banal ideas of sensations like wind and light and something caressing something else in the image rather than movement.
Yes. Yeah.
Or rather than progressing. And so I think there's a generation of artists who are aware of this recasting into a virtual darkroom, where a place is observed not through the lens but through ideas. Again, and there's what that is in itself is a source for a lot of anxiety and a lot of debate around the authenticity of the image, of the picture.
We're heading towards cocktail hour. If there's one last question, oh, there we are.
Well, if you have the view, then it's not an impossibility anymore, then it's possible. There is a less visible but equally simple transformation when you have many views on a supposedly singular moment, is that the photographic starts giving up its skin and starts transforming into something which is far more heavy-weighted, maybe, and perhaps become sculptural, although I have to be clear, not sculpture in the sense of art, but object-like. And maybe therefore sculpted, so it can be accused of being produced. Yeah. I think that's maybe important, that it can be accused of being produced, that it can, that it, not that it certainly is artificial, but that you can start to see it as something which didn't have the ephemerality of the photograph, but which in turn took on a certain body of like the kids on the Algiers Square, which in turn takes on a certain body of space. So it's like Impressionists did. It's a sort of materialistic discourse on photography.
But can I just throw in a sort of historical? I love the way you put it about this sort of suspended moment that you can move around in relation to the future. And I know you're doing it virtually, but there is this technique that started to be used in the 90s, which interestingly the British called time slice, and Hollywood decided to call bullet time because they like guns. You know, the idea that you have a whole a bank of cameras, let's say 48 cameras, so let's say arcing around, let's say it's Keanu Reeves, because it was used in the Matrix a lot, wasn't it? You know, where the world appears to stop, and a camera movement appears to.
It's a hungry camera.
Trace a kind of arc through it, and it's made by having many cameras that shoot simultaneously, and you then see the frames consecutively. So it gives this. The interesting thing is, if you go to the last pages of Edward Muybridge's studies of human locomotion, and we've got one of the horse studies in the show. Muybridge has these shots of figures in fixed poses, but shot from different angles, and he could have animated them because he was animating his others. He could have animated it, and we could have had 150 years of bullet time, time slice. We really could have had that, but there was no desire for it, and image forms do not appear unless they're desired. They don't just come about. So there must have been something kind of millennial about wanting to suspend a scene and move through it. But it's actually a thoroughly 19th century technology. It really could have happened, and it's a wonderful sort of anomaly that it didn't. So that question, the way you put it there, could have come up then, but we didn't want it. Nobody wanted it, but it could have been. So we're going to have to get out. There's a movie screening in here at 8. You've been rather fantastic, as have you, David. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. If you want to continue the conversation, we have to leave the room rather quickly to let the people in for an actual movie. Thank you very much.
Thank you.